Well, hello, boys and girls. Welcome to the Business and Its Environment. Hopefully, you don't have as much snow as we have here in Vermtown today, but I've got my winter skunk hat on, so I'm warm. I hope you are too. Well, I see looking at our course syllabus that on Sunday at midnight we have our first assessment test that is due. So I've received a few emails from you asking about proctoring the exam and so forth and so on. The really good news is that, like the quizzes, there is no proctoring for any of my quizzes or assessment tests. You do need, of course, the lockdown browser, which is discussed in the course syllabus. So make sure you're loaded up with that and you should be good to go. There are 100 questions. You've got 100 minutes to play with them. So plan accordingly, okay? It will be covering chapters 1 through 6 and also the movies that you've seen. This is a heavy week of work because you also have chapter 7 that we're covering today along with its routine quiz. So again, I invite you to send me email questions when they pop up, and I'll do my best to get right back with you with a response. So with that, let us march into today's topic for discussion, which is business ethics. Back to my old friend, French philosopher Voltaire, before you address me, please define your terms. And so I have a lot of students who seem confused about the word ethics, and they attribute it to being, well, a subject that is gray and depends on your point of view and the ethics of, one person, more often than not are substantially different, from somebody else's. And so, I listened to those responses, and while everybody has a right to their opinion, they don't have a right to their own facts. And the fact is, that's not what ethics is defined to be. Ethics is simply defined in the Socrates sense to be right and wrong decision making. Yes, it's that simple. Ethics is right and wrong decision making. Let me prove it to you. Consider the term unethical conduct. We probably can agree that what the Wells Fargo employees who engaged in opening up credit card and line of credit accounts without approval of the account holders, there were 5,300 Wells Fargo employees involved in that fraudulent scam. I bet most reasonable people would say that's an example of unethical behavior. Okay? Well, if that is true, let's flip it over on the other side. So what is ethical behavior? Right behavior, as distinguished from wrong behavior. So that's our baseline from which or lens through which we evaluate business dilemmas. So as you hopefully have read in your chapter 7 for today, it discusses the former CEO of WorldCom. And of course, everybody in business remembers the demise of WorldCom and its infamous CEO, Bernie Ebbers. Now, what distinguishes WorldCom is that it is the largest business bankruptcy in history. That's quite an achievement, right? And so Bernie Ebbers is the CEO, and he was charged with 9 counts of criminal conspiracy, securities fraud, and filing false documents with the Securities and Exchange Commission. His chief financial officer reported false quarterly revenue in 2000 to disguise rising expenses. Now, we would all agree that's fraudulent behavior, both civilly and criminally. And of course, you sit back and ask the question, how do people at that level ethically engage in that type of behavior? And of course, we would say, well, that's not ethical behavior at all. That's highly unethical. Why do they do that? You don't get to be CEO or CFO of WorldCom by being stupid. And so people ponder and ask the question, well, why did he do it? Well, Ebers was prosecuted and given a lovely 25-year sentence because he maintained throughout his trial he knew nothing about any of the fraud that was going on at WorldCom, even though his five closest subordinates, to include his CFO, testified against him that, he not only knew about the fraud, he directed it. Well, Ebers was able to drive his BMW to jail, but to this day, he still claims he knew nothing about the fraud at all. Hard to believe. And the jury wasn't persuaded. And the reason why I think he received such an incredible sentence of 25 years incarceration is that I think the members of the jury, not to mention the judge, felt that he had violated the public trust. Clearly, shareholders lost over 90% of the value of their WorldCom shares, and a serious crime calls for serious punishment. So that leads us to ask the question, so what was Bernie Ebers and all of his, senior executives, thinking? What were their, ethics involved in this particular, fraudulent scam? And the same question at about the same time could be asked of Enron's Ken Lay, who's the CEO there, and Jeffrey Skilling, the president, and Arthur Fastow, the CFO. Similar types of fraud. Well, you don't get to be leaders of organizations that big by being stupid. And so one has to peel back and ask the penetrating questions. So explain to me why you think that conduct is okay. And then I think, we will see what's called amorality, that business decisions are being made without any connection to ethical standards, restraints, and ideals in society. So, for example, in the movie Wall Street, you saw Gordon Gekko. Gordon Gekko was certainly practicing amorality. That is, hey, he wasn't into ethical behavior. Remember, he said, hey, that's for suckers. That's for suckers. Well, is it really? Bernie Ebers would probably subscribe to that, saying, hey, anything goes in the world of business. Well, what about ethics? Bernie would say, that's for suckers. Well, the opposite theory at the end of that continuum says, no, business should be involved in moral unity, which requires a connection between business standards and society's ethical standards. In other words, we don't have one set of ethical standards for business and one for society, or a different one for our personal or private lives. It doesn't work that way. You are either, ethical or unethical in your behavior at home, at work. It's not like a coat that an ethical coat that you take off and on. It's not the way it works. And of course, we know the law provides a moral minimum of behavior that people must adhere to. And if they don't, there are going to be sanctions. And we'll talk more about that in just a moment. So what are the sources of ethical values in business? Where do we get them? Where do we get them? Where do they come from? That I'm advocating business, should continue to train their employees on, and of course practice. So we got four sources. The first one being sometimes referred to as the fundamentalism source. That is a code of conduct, a set of ethical values that are based on some type of religious basis. The Quran, the Bible, the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. Thou shalt not engage in other types, covet thy neighbor's wife, and so forth and so on. Hey, these are ethical rules, standards, if you will, that all great religions in the world practice, regardless of continent or culture. A second source, of course, is 2,000 years of philosophy. And this is where my good friend Socrates comes into play, saying that, ethics is about what we ought to do. Ooh, pretty simple. Socrates says, hey, ethics is about what we ought to do, right and wrong decision making. A third source of ethical values is certainly cultural experience, which shapes our ethical values. And so I can tell you from personal experience, American ethical values are substantially different from those practiced in Russia. And I've advised lots of people don't do business in Russia because their business ethics are absolutely scandalous, as you will painfully discover. Just about every business that has gone over to do business with Russia has come back with horrific experiences. So, these are the things that we believe do permeate the business environment. Ethical universalism, ethical relativism is something that does have varying ethical standards. So, for example, women in Islamic countries are treated differently than women are in the United States. I may have mentioned on a previous occasion during Operation Desert Shield, which preceded Desert Storm in 1990, I was helping to negotiate a contract for Saudi Air Force mechanical support with Lockheed. And Lockheed sent over a negotiator, and the negotiator's name was Nader, Naider. And I really didn't look to see what the gender was of this vice president for contracting who was coming over. And when I met the vice president at the airport in Riyadh, Nader was a woman. And I was stunned because I hadn't picked up on that from the communications that I'd had with Lockheed. And I knew this was going to be a problem, that I knew the Saudis wouldn't negotiate with a woman. So as we're in my car, we're going to the Sheraton, where she was not only going to stay, but where the negotiations were going to start the next day. I had to explain to her that in Saudi Arabia, women are not viewed on an ethical equivalency with men. Now, while that obviously clashes with the United States ethical standards, this is a cultural fact, and we have to work with that. So I told her they won't negotiate with her. Did she have a deputy or an associate that she could fly over right away that could be essentially her proxy? And that when we came to parts of the negotiation, I could say I needed to use the bathroom in order to provide space and time for him to consult her in her room upstairs. So she said, sure, she understood, and so she flew over her assistant, and I explained to him how we were going to handle this. And any time he wanted to take a break to consult his boss, he was to simply tap me underneath the table my knee, and I would have a need to go to the bathroom. And we would suspend the negotiations until he came back, and that's what we did. Now, it took us an abnormally long time to complete this negotiation with Saudis, but with many bathroom breaks, but it worked. And that we were to do what we simply refer to as a workaround. So when you have cultural problems like this, you have to take them into account, and there always is a workaround if you want to do it. And as I already mentioned, the law codifies and formalizes ethical expectations, as Bernie Ebbers found out. So when Bernie violated the SEC and criminal and civil fraud statutes, well, we have an ethical legal minimum floor that he fell beneath, and our legal system punished him accordingly with 25 years in prison. Certainly, there are always compensatory damages that are awarded, and certainly Bernie and his associates were sued and cleaned out for civil compensatory damages. Punitive damages are awarded in criminal fraud, cases, and so obviously that was involved here. We saw that again in the ExxonMobil with the Exxon Valdez gross negligence case of the super tanker in Prince William Sound, being mismanaged grossly by, that is the failure in a reckless and wanton manner by the Exxon crew. Certainly, we do prosecute, and as we're going to see later on, the government, the Department of Justice, and through its United States attorneys, and there are 94 United States attorneys' offices around the country, they prosecute crime, business crime, if you will. The doctrine of respondeat superior, that's a Latin term meaning, let the, king answer for, the servant. And so the acts of assistants and others will be imputed to principals. And so, as in Bernie's case, Bernie not only was responsible for what happened at WorldCom, but also his assistants were held liable too, if they're committing crimes in the course of their employment, supposedly on behalf of the company. Clearly, as Wells Fargo is discovering currently, going to court is bad for business. Companies spend a fortune on brand polishing. And so the last thing that helps them grow their business is criminal prosecution. So the best one I can think of that actually resulted in the demise of the company was Arthur Andersen. Now, Arthur Andersen, gee whiz, who was WorldCom's accounting firm? Who was their auditor? You guessed right, Arthur Andersen. Who was Enron's auditor and accountant? You got it, Arthur Andersen. And so you look at the top 100 bankruptcies in the 10 years surrounding 2000, 2001, Arthur Andersen was one of the big five that had a lot of these accounts. Well, the Department of Justice sued Arthur Andersen, and of course they were convicted. And who wanted to have Arthur Andersen as their auditor or accounting firm? Nobody. So Delta Airlines, everybody that had them as an accounting firm dropped them like a hot rock. And inside of 6 months, she died. She went away. Nobody wanted Arthur Andersen as their accounting firm. Think of all those partners and everybody who lost all of their equity. Well, that's what a criminal prosecution can do. Now, I had heard through some of my friends that Arthur Andersen wanted to plead guilty to some of the charges and get on with their business life and get out of the problems that they were encountering. And so, but I had heard strangely that the Department of Justice would not accept a guilty plea from Arthur Andersen. I found that strange and odd because I'd never heard of that before. So I called a friend of mine in San Antonio who was an assistant U.S. attorney who had served with me in the Army as a judge advocate, asked him about the rumor. Is it true that the DOJ would not accept a guilty plea from Arthur Andersen? And he said, yes. That shocked me. He went on to say, well, the decision has been made at the highest level that we're going to kill. And that was his operative term. We're going to kill Arthur Andersen. Since when does the United States government kill a business? I mean, I'd never heard of this before. And that really shocked me, surprised me, alarmed me, which I conveyed to my assistant U.S. attorney friend. He said, you need to understand, Arthur Andersen has been at the bottom of accounting misconduct for the past 20 years. I mean, you name all the big, accounting frauds and scams, and guess who is in the middle of it? He said, so, hey, they've run out of probation. They are going to be put out of business. And guess what? They were put out of business. So, in, of course, extraordinary cases, we find as in Enron and in WorldCom, executives get prosecuted to take the fall, if you will, because they're the ones who make the unethical decisions that sometimes involve unlawful activity as well. We certainly, not just 2000, 2001, but certainly in 2008, have gone through cycles of corporate crime, prosecutions. Just in the Enron case, the Enron task force alone had 20 convictions. Can you imagine 20 executives in Enron being criminally convicted for not only legal misconduct, but certainly ethical misconduct too? We talked about the F word before, the fiduciary relationship, the fiduciary duty that all employees owe their employers, a duty of utmost trust. We would readily say, yes, Bernie Ebbers violated his fiduciary relationship to WorldCom. Ken Lay, the CEO at Enron, Jeffrey Skilling, the president, Arthur Fastow, the CFO, all violated their fiduciary duty to Enron and were sued civilly after their criminal convictions. So judges, don't make it up as they go along in terms of punishments. They have federal guidelines. They're called federal sentencing guidelines that essentially help decide, what the punishment should be. So when you have really egregious cases, as in Bernie Ebbers and WorldCom, then of course you're going to be at the high end of the punishments. So with that as perhaps a painful background, let's talk about what business forces out there shape ethical conduct, in business enterprises today. I think the first, point is pretty obvious that, leaders set the ethical tone. And if you got a straight-laced, highly ethical CEO, I think that's going to permeate down to lower levels of managers and all the way down to the employees. But if you happen to have unethical CEOs and leaders, as we saw in both Enron and WorldCom, to name just a few, not to mention Arthur Andersen, you're going to have those types of ethics permeating down to the worker bee level. And I think we're seeing that in the Wells Fargo cases now. Wells Fargo today in the Wall Street Journal, again, is got itself wrapped around all sorts of axles. The Fed has even ordered the removal of 4 members of the board of directors of Wells Fargo. I've never heard of that before. That's a first. Never before has the Fed ordered the removal of a member of a corporate board of directors. It shows the Fed is getting tired of these types of scams, and they believe leaders are not setting the ethical tone at their company, and so they're now beginning to hammer the leaders. And to get, so who are the four that are going to get booted off the board of directors at Wells Fargo? I bet that's going to be an interesting food fight. I like to tell the story of Land's End. Land's End had a vice president for marketing, for sales, who was absolutely the golden boy at Land's End. I mean, he made Land's End a ton of money, and everybody knew he was the most prized and valued employee because he really brought in the do-re-mi. Well, Land's End, like a lot of companies, had a policy, a written policy in its HR handbook that prohibited sexual conduct or affairs, between managers and employees. And this one day, this cleaning lady one night was entering the marketing vice president's office to clean it. And of course, who is having a sexual affair on his couch in his office suite but the vice president for marketing and his secretary? Well, as you might imagine, the informal network, became electrified with that news. And of course, it got up to the CEO. And of course, everybody in the company is wondering, what's going to happen now? Is the highly valued vice president for marketing going to get a pass because he's an executive cheese? Or is he going to get the hammer that lower level employees would get? So everybody was waiting to see what the CEO was going to do. And the CEO was a major stockholder in Land's End. Well, he finally called a meeting. He had a meeting, had a big all hands on deck meeting in their atrium, and announced that a decision had been made regarding the ethical misconduct of one of the senior managers. Of course, everybody is there waiting to hear, oh, baby, how is this going down? He said that the vice president for marketing, and named him, had been terminated with prejudice and would no longer have anything to do with Land's End. Wow. Boy, that ricocheted through the employees faster than anything. Well, what do you think about the ethical climate at Land's End? I would suggest, it's tighter than a drum. That manager, that leader, led by example. And yes, he took a very painful decision, but he really reinforced the ethical tone and climate of his company. So it's true that, each company has an ethical dimension, corporate culture, if you will, sets of values, norms, rituals, formal rules, and so forth. It used to be certain companies. I remember IBM. IBM required its employees, its men, had to wear white shirts, black ties, and a hat was required. It was one of their formal rules, obviously back in the 50s and 60s. General Electric certainly had a corporate culture. It's pretty, under Jack Welch, was pretty aggressive. He would terminate the bottom 10% of his executives each year. Those that were in the the bottom 10% of their annual evaluations would be let go. And everybody knew that. So that was a pretty tight and highly competitive and aggressive work environment. So certainly, as we have seen recently with Wells Fargo, when employees don't live up to rules and codes, they're going to be let go. And since we're dealing with adults, playtime is over, school is over, and the cases you've heard about Fannie Mae and Consolidated Edison and these others, hey, that type of behavior just, is not going to be tolerated. And if it does, you're going to be corrupting and corroding with an ethical cancer the company's moral values. And we've seen this over and over and over again. And that's one of the reasons why I have you subscribe to the Wall Street Journal. So there is some evidence to show that ethical behavior can be associated with demographic traits, such as certainly more educated people, you would expect them to behave more ethically because they should know more about ethical behavior. Religious belief, so certainly there are lots of places in the country that are pretty strict on ethical behavior. Idaho and Utah have religious foundations that are very strong in their work environment. Age, work experience, these are all significant factors that affect ethical decision making. Personality traits, those don't get studied as much, but I think when you start looking at some of these CEOs, what are the personality traits that lead to ethical behavior or unethical conduct, as the case may be. Here's an interesting research finding. The evidence suggests that individuals are heavily influenced by situations. And so again, I think we fall back to a company's ethical climate. Let me put it differently. I've always thought crisis is the test of faith. And having worked as a military attorney for 27 years, I'm used to crisis because we have a lot of crisis, and that's what the armed forces do. They handle crises, right? And I found it's true. Crisis is the test of faith. So you find out in a crisis what you're really made of. So let's take, for example, because I think this is a great business example, Johnson & Johnson back in 1983. Johnson & Johnson Pharmaceuticals, probably the third largest pharmaceutical company in the world. And there's some nutcase in Chicago that puts arsenic in their Tylenol bottles. Several people died. I think 3 people died. Well, the FDA did not have any rules, regulations, or requirements about tamper-proof bottle tops. But Johnson & Johnson had a code of ethics, and you may want to look at their website. It's still the same code, that they only produce products and sell products that are safe for medical care providers and patients. Well, this clearly violated that code of ethics. Did Johnson & Johnson respond? And if so, how? Man, like lightning, they voluntarily, on their own initiative, pulled off all their bottles off all sales shelves worldwide within a week. They set about to design, manufacture, and then, of course, distribute the first ever tamper-proof bottle top. Now, they weren't required, they weren't ordered, it wasn't even suggested by the government that they should undertake this activity. Yet Johnson & Johnson voluntarily, knowingly, willingly, intelligently did this on their own, even though it cost them $250 million. Yet this is who they were in the dark when nobody else was watching. And when crisis occurred, as in this arsenic case, they were able as a whole company to move in the same direction because they had a corporate culture that they saw being threatened by this arsenic case. So I sit on the University Athletic Board of Control here at the University of South Dakota, and the athletic department, like all other college athletic departments, has a full-time compliance officer. You have no idea how many regulations the NCAA has. I'm here to tell you. They have regulations that even prohibit anybody in the athletic department, or the university for that matter, from giving a Coca-Cola or a cookie to a potential recruit. So I'm here to tell you, the NCAA has boatloads of regulations and policies. And it's the compliance officer who is responsible, who reports to us every month, what compliance violations have occurred and what investigations are ongoing and who's doing what to whom. And so compliance at the NCAA level, I'm here to tell you, is big business and serious. And so it should be with every company that there needs to be a compliance program that reinforces, of course, your ethical and legal, policies, procedures, and controls, what we sometimes refer to as preventive maintenance. What are the policies that help build an ethical culture? And of course, a key component of that is compliance. As in my Land's End case, there has to be a cause and effect relationship in terms of compliance. So, and there have been just lots and lots of examples. And again, I don't mean to mislead you into thinking, oh, wow, business is corrupt. No, it's not. And so the cases that you read about in the Wall Street Journal are exceptions to the rule. But I think they're useful learning platforms for us. And that's why I have you subscribe to them. Certainly, Sarbanes-Oxley, which was enacted in January of 2002 after WorldCom's demise and Enron's demise. Remember, we have discussed before, to every action in business in terms of misconduct, there's going to be a reaction. And so Sarbanes-Oxley that mandated codes of conduct, compliance systems, and reports to the SEC and annual reports to the shareholders and new accounting standards and all came about as a result of Sarbanes-Oxley reacting to what occurred in 2000, 2001. So some people refer to it as the Full Employment Act for accountants, because CEOs and CFOs are required under Sarbanes-Oxley to personally authenticate, i.e. sign, every document going to the SEC. And of course, there are penalties for signing false documents, right? Well, what CEO or CFO is going to want to sign a document going to the SEC, putting them at risk, unless they absolutely positively know without a shadow of a doubt that the document is accurate? So that's why we call this the Full Employment Act for accountants, because companies hired battalions, more accountants, to check, inspect, and correct their accounting system. So I would suggest that was a good thing, albeit brought about because of misconduct. So with employees as part of the annual training program, and when I entered the Army in 1976, we had an annual ethics training program, 2 hours, that to this very day the Department of Defense still has. Everybody, every 4-star general down to every private, has to have the annual 2 hours of ethical legal training. It's good, I suggest, because it reminds us of integrity, truth, and fairness requirements. And I think those are important components of who and what we are. Now, while obviously there's always, criminal liability out there, civil liability in violation of the fiduciary relationship is the more common situation, because if shareholders lose money because of the misconduct of employees, civil suits are going to likely result. Clearly, when we have individuals with a history of illegal or unethical conduct, those folks have character problems. And I'm afraid I'm not one of those who believes in a lot of rehabilitation for character flaws. I think from a business perspective, school is out, and the only fix is to terminate the employment thereof. And that's what's been happening at Wells Fargo. Not only did John Stump, the CEO, be forced to retire after his less than satisfactory testimony before the Senate Financial Services Committee, but also their vice president for sales was also forcibly retired, as well as 4 members of the board of director initially, and now there's a second group of 4 members of the board of directors that have to leave, mandated by the Fed. So clearly unloading those that are rowing in the wrong direction is, I think, a painful but yet necessary managerial act. And again, I think having annual training and certainly initial training for all new employees as to what the ethical code of conduct for the company is, informing employees as to how they can report anonymously or otherwise company misconduct. And then, of course, you need monitors and audits of an organization. I always find audits to be incredibly healthy and good things to do. They uncover internally mistakes. I am of the belief the vast majority, 99%, of people in business are highly ethical, honorable, and act lawfully every day. Yet, I make mistakes. I wished I could say I'm Professor Perfect, but I don't think I would convince you of that. And so not being able to convince you of that, I think we need systems, and that's what I think audits provide, a system for discovering mistakes and correcting them. What I simply like to refer to as checking, inspecting, and correcting. I think if you care in a company to check, inspect, and correct, that will improve the ethical climate of the company and certainly highlight unethical people and give you the opportunity to unload them before they do any serious damage to your company. And also, if you come across criminal behavior, fraud, for example, to report that and root that out. So your text discussed the case of Martha Stewart, and she was an interesting player, if you will. What most people don't know about Martha is that her initial job, she was a stockbroker. Would you believe that? Most people don't know that she started out being a stockbroker. So of all people who should know about fiduciary duties and fraud and insider trading and all, hey, it's Martha. So, you've got the story of Sam Waxel, the president, the CEO of ImClone, who finds out that one of ImClone's patent applications is going to be denied. And once that becomes public, that certainly is going to put their ImClone stock in a nosedive. So he not only sells all his ImClone stock, he has his daughter sell hers, and he calls Martha Stewart's stockbroker because she's a personal friend of his to tell her to unload the stock too. And of course, as we know, she is caught by her stockbroker between planes in Dallas, I think it was. And so she tells him, okay, go ahead and sell the stock. And here she is, a multi-millionaires, and here this ImClone sales only involves about $50,000, but it shows what her character was. So she knew this was insider trading and that it was unlawful. And when the FBI comes to interview her, she lies under oath. They not only get an oral statement from her, they get her to put it in writing. No sooner had she finished signing the written statement, lying about knowing about the information, the insider information, they put the handcuffs on her. She got charged with 8 counts of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and making false statements to investigators. So what can we say about Martha Stewart's ethics? Not much, right? So she got a chance to go to jail for 6 months, and she is prohibited for the rest of her life from sitting on any publicly traded boards of directors, to include her own company. So insider trading is, as you already know, I hope, unlawful. And the question is asked from time to time, what constitutes insider trading? Certainly buying or selling a company's stock based on information not available to the public. That's simply for employees at any level, that's certainly a breach of fiduciary duty, right? So there's no question Martha and all of her cohorts violated the law, but what does that say about her ethics? Not much, because I don't think Martha can tell the difference between right or wrong when it comes to her. Like Gordon Gekko, she, sees everything through the lens of relativism. Whatever helps her, enriches her, hey, that's a good thing, ethically. Really? That's why she needed to go to jail for 6 months. Did the U.S. Attorneys and Securities and Exchange Commission use good judgment in indicting Martha? Yeah, absolutely. I think those to whom much is given, much is expected. And when they violate the public trust, they need to get hammered. So while 6 months isn't a long time, I got news for you. 6 months in a federal prison is not fun and games. And so I'm sure that was a radical change in Martha's lifestyle. And, she's now a convicted felon. Oh boy. Now, you can always, debate, was her punishment sufficient or adequate? I mean, look at her punishment compared to Bernie Ebbers' 25-year sentence. Big difference? Yeah. But, again, you have to look at the point of the exercise, and she was a stockholder, whereas Bernie Ebbers was the CEO. So, interesting. So clearly, the vast majority of these cases always end up in settlements or guilty pleas of some type. And again, companies rightly try and avoid public displays because it reflects badly on the company image and name, as Wells Fargo is enduring, currently. Now Wells Fargo is predicting they may end up losing money because of all the fines and restrictions that the Fed and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has placed upon them. And I would suggest there's more to come, because the ethics at Wells Fargo, at a minimum, I think is highly suspect. And where there's smoke, there usually is fire. Well, boys and girls, that's what I wanted to share with you today. And so, again, I want to invite you to send me any emails. Make sure you get that first assessment test and quiz and all done this weekend. I realize it's a lot to do, but I have got everything posted for you. So all your discussion posts, all of your ethics paper posts, everything is up there. So I recommend, seizing the opportunity to work ahead when you can. Stay well, and let me hear from you. Bye-bye.